Okay, so I'm just going to go through materials from scratch in Revit as per the program here. And so you'll find with Revit it's got a great approach to managing materials, and the only issue really is that in some ways they give you too many features, and that creates a little bit of confusion with the management of materials, particularly the rendering materials. But once you understand how it's set up, it's all pretty straightforward, and you shouldn't have any issues. The graphics aspect is much easier, but again, I'm often surprised how much confusion there is about even that part of the materials in Revit, so I'm just going to go through all of it. And so I've got here set up a very simple view. It's just a call out of part of the floor plan, and I've got a call out of the same area in section, and actually now that is so that's got to be brought over a little bit to show the walls. Sorry, did I? Oh no, sorry, that's wrong call out. So that's the call out I meant to show you, which is showing the same area, and if I come over here to the right, we should have those lifts. There we are. Okay, so and then I've also got a 3D view set up, again just showing the same area, just so I can show you the way materials work in all those different kinds of views. So starting with the floor plan, I'm simply going to select one of the walls and then go to edit type, and you can see then that it's a very basic wall type. So you'll see if you obviously go to the drop down there, we've got some other basic wall types preloaded that'll be set up in most of the files you begin with. And I might go to stud steel, just so you can see there, if I click edit, that it's actually not that different initially to the generic wall. So I go back to generic wall, 100mm, and click edit, and you can see there's only one element, or one layer. So that's where I'll begin with materials. I'll go back to stud steel 90, click edit, and I'm going to begin with that one. You can see there that it's, again, like I was saying, got just the one layer. That's probably the first confusing thing about Revit, especially if you're coming from an AutoCAD background, that these are actually called layers in Revit. So the technical terminology in Revit uses layers for the different elements in walls and floors, and then when you import things from AutoCAD, or if you are managing things in Revit the same way as you do in AutoCAD, the equivalent of AutoCAD layers is actually object styles, and I'll show you object styles in a moment. So that does come in handy with layers as well. You will often want to use object styles to set materials. But again, in this case, I'm using layers, so I'm going to set some materials to the layers. We've already got a layer there which is set to metal. I'm just going to quickly go back to that generic wall type, and then you can see if I click edit there for the structure that it's got finish. You might see in some cases that it's set to by category. So I'm going to click browse there. And you'll see this quite often when you first open up materials in Revit. It might take a minute. Don't worry about that. It's just loading the rendering engine. It only happens the first time. And so you can, if you click on the button in the bottom left-hand corner there, set it back to by category, which is kind of the default option with Revit. So if I go to by category there, you can see it's got it in those angled brackets, and that actually means it's using the object style. So it's like using by layer in AutoCAD. You're setting the material using that overall setting. So you'd have a material that's the default setting for walls, and so anything that doesn't have a material set here is going to use that default material. And it's really useful to know that, because you often will want an overall material for things like walls and floors that's used by default, and that way you don't have to come in and manually set a material for everything. But in this case, it's probably not a bad idea to have metal as the material to begin with. And I'm going to come back to to material assignments after I go through the actual materials as well in a minute. So we've got to look at the way this is going to show based on the material assignment. But for now, again, just clicking there to browse. Now you can see it's got the metal material. So I'll just spend a bit of time looking at the way materials are set up. And so you can see that it's got the graphics and the appearance tab. You also have the identity tab, which gives you things like the name and other sort of text-based elements. It's good to know that, because often you will want to change some of these details. But then you have the appearance tab, which should be there usually. You can actually turn that off, but it should be there usually. And those are the main ones. So graphics and appearance, where you do most of the work. Physical and thermal are optional, so they can be deleted. So you can see there you can't easily delete appearance, even though it is possible to sometimes get a material without appearance. But you can delete physical and thermal, so they are optional. But again, coming back to graphics, you can see you've got these three elements. And so like I was saying, there's a little bit of confusion about the way they work. You can see there the colour is this off-white colour for metal. So that's the shading colour. And there's no surface pattern, no cut pattern. But if I just click OK to quickly get out of that, obviously in plan, that wall is showing grey. So any idea why it's showing grey when the shading colour is off-white? Pretty much, yeah, there is a graphics option. So if I select that wall again and go to Edit Type, you've got this graphics section here where it's got a coarse fill pattern and fill colour. And so that will override any material setting.
Is that depending on where you find?
Exactly, that's right, yeah. So here it's on coarse. If I go to fine, then it will have that shading colour. But only if it's got a shaded setting here. So with hidden line, you won't get any colour when it's being cut, no matter what. So all of these walls, you can see they're all white. And it's a little bit confusing when you explain it, but it's actually quite sensible the way it's set up. It's set up so that it's useful. And so going back to coarse again, we've got grey. So if I select one of those walls, I can go to Edit Type and change the colour here in the coarse fill pattern to, let's just go to blue. So all of the walls of that type will change to blue. Now this wall is not the same type, so that one was generic. So all my generic walls have changed, but the stud metal or stud steel is still grey. So let's go back to Edit Type. You can see the other wall over here changed because that was the same type. So here back to grey, 128, 128, 128 is what it was, I think. It's a bit touchy, this thing, and there is not a, I don't think that, oh yeah, there is a preset for it anyway. Okay, so back to fine, and so now if I want to see colour, I can go to shaded, and then if I go to Edit Type and look at that material now, and so actually before I do that, I'll just change these other two walls to the same wall type, stud steel. Then back to Edit Type, and then editing the material. So if I change the colour here, let's just go to one that's going to stand out, then click Apply, and you can see straight away that the walls now are changing colour. So that shaded colour will come up, it should come up, when you've got a shaded view. And there we go, so that's back to something close to what it was before. Apply again, so that's back to the off-white colour. But I'll just go back and make the colour a bit darker now, and just go to a grey there. Okay, so I've got this grey colour, and that's pretty consistent in the plan view. It's also going to come up in the section view. So if I go to the section, we can see there the wall now has that. Oh, sorry, that's coarse. So if we go to fine, and then that's got white because it's hidden line. If I go to shaded, again, it's going to have that grey colour now, but it's also got it in elevation. So I'm just going to be aware of that. And if I show you then in the 3D view, again, hidden line, we're not going to see it, but in shaded, I will. But you can see really clearly there, this is the same two walls, and they're quite clearly different colours there. So this one's a darker grey to this one. So it's view dependent, or it's dependent on the angle of your view. If I orbit there, it's going to change. So you can see now the back of this wall is darker than this wall. So it's dependent on the angle of your object relative to the lights. They've got these default lights in there, and so it's trying to simulate the lighting in a way. And that's kind of nice to have that indication of lighting for indicative views, but you may want the colours to be as you've set them, no matter what. So that's what you have consistent colours for. So with consistent colours, instead of shaded, it'll always have the colour you've set, which can be useful. Often you do want the exact colour you've set, no matter what. Okay, so that's your shaded colour. I'm going to go back to hidden line now. And so in some cases you may want a solid colour no matter what. So even in the hidden line view, I might want this wall to be hatched with a certain colour. And so to do that, I'm just going to select the wall again, back to here, edit, and then look at the material. Okay, so obviously with the hidden line view, I'm not going to get that shaded colour. But you have cut pattern, and you can set that to a solid fill. So I could make that a grey, and that way, even in a hidden line view, all of those walls are going to be filled in with that colour. And of course, with that cut pattern option, you can set a pattern instead of a colour or a solid fill. So you've got all these hatch patterns which are preloaded. Just expand that so you can see them. It's not a huge selection, it's not as much as you get with AutoCAD, but it's still reasonable, and it, I suppose, covers most of the standard material patterns you need. It's important to realise these are symbols, so they're not a drawing of the material. They're graphical graphical symbol, and so for metal, for example, it can be a bit tricky because metal sometimes doesn't have a hatch pattern, but if it does, it's usually just a simple cross hatch. And so you can see there we've got no real indication of the size. There is a size. If you click edit, you'll see it, but it's not even indicated in the name because it's not really that important. And here I'll just show you why. Because I've got a crosshatch set there, but if I change the scale of this view, that hatch is going to change size. That just makes it clear, hopefully, that it's a symbolic pattern. And when you look back at the other cut patterns, you'll see there are no... Oops, I clicked on the pattern there. There are no patterns there that look like a drawing of the material, except maybe the concrete pattern. But again, that is a symbolic pattern, even though it looks kind of like an aggregate. So maybe I might say I want this to be a brick wall, just again to keep going with patterns. So I'll go back to, let's just start with brick 110, edit, and look at that material. So for graphics there, you've got the cut pattern set to the standard brickwork pattern, which is obviously your 45-degree doubled lines. Clicking edit there, you can see that unlike a lot of these other patterns, where you have basically just a spacing and an angle, so it's just like cross-hatching that you can draw, you simply need to set a spacing in millimetres, that is the spacing it would be when you print it out, and then Revit handles the scale and adjusts that accordingly. And you set an angle and decide whether it's a double or a crosshatch or single. So that's the only option you have when you're making hatch patterns using the settings that you have in Revit. But like I was showing you, the brickwork pattern, if we click edit there, is a little bit more complicated. Might not seem like a very complicated one, but it does have things that you can't get just by putting settings in. So that's using a file that you need to import. And a lot of these patterns are like that, even the drafting patterns, which is what I'm showing you. So same with this one here, obviously. Okay, so all of those patterns though are drafting patterns, you can see down the bottom here. So you don't have the option of choosing model with cut patterns. And I think that's frustrating actually. I think you should be able to choose model patterns for cut patterns, because there are instances where it would be extremely useful. So for example with concrete block, where you want to see the courses when it's being cut. Unfortunately there's no way of doing that in Revit. You can only set drafting patterns, so they're always going to change size when you change the scale. So if you want to do your courses, the only automatic way with Revit is to use things like repeating details or parts, and that'll do it. But you can't do it with hatch patterns. But again, just to make it clear, these are drafting patterns. They're symbols, and they will change size relative to your objects as you change the scale. Surface patterns, on the other hand, are model patterns usually. And this is where I think Revit's, it's a bit strange the way they've decided to do this, because they do give you the option of using drafting patterns for surface patterns. And I've played around with it. I don't see why you would ever want to do that. It doesn't make sense to me in any way, because, like I was saying, they will change size relative to your object as you change scale. And I don't know why you would ever want that, because you see the objects from the outside, you're seeing the surface of the object, and that means that in the views where you are seeing the pattern, you're seeing basically a drawing of the material. It's going to change size in the views if you change scale, which doesn't make sense. So I just tell all my students in all my other classes, never use drafting for surface patterns, always just use model, which is the default option anyway, so that's fairly easy. And remember that they are basically a drawing of the material. So for bricks, you're going to get a drawing of brickwork, an elevation. So for herringbone, again, you get a drawing showing you the way that that brick pattern or timber flooring, whatever it is, you've got in the herringbone pattern, it's a drawing of that. And then again, you can see all of these basically are a drawing. The crosshatches, you're probably not going to have too many things that look like that, but you definitely will have for things like flooring, horizontal and vertical lines, so they're really useful for timber flooring and those things. But again, brickwork is one of the most obvious. Right, so, and again, once that's clear, then it can make it, again, a lot clearer what the colour here does. So the shading colour, obviously, is doing the fill in shaded views, but then the colour options here for the surface and the cut pattern do the colour for the pattern. But again, you can use that solid fill option in some cases if you want a solid material or a solid colour. And you can also use these in combination. So with the surface pattern set to grey there, just click OK. And the cut pattern is grey as well, so I've got these grey lines. But if I go to a shaded view, it's going to use the brown colour that's set to shading along with the cut colour, or the pattern colour. Right, so I might go back to the stud steel wall type, and then just look at adding in some layers there. So back to edit type, edit for the structure, and so you can see that this is quite common when you're doing initial draft presentations, that you have sometimes just one layer for a wall, even though you know there are many components in the wall, because you have all those options in Revit for setting, one material for the cut pattern to one thing, and then the surface pattern, and also the shading colour to something else. And so that way you can get a plain surface on the outside while it's still showing the cut pattern. But as you add more detail in your projects, you'll probably want to show those components, and you'll also need to set materials to those as you go. So back to edit type, and I'm going to edit the structure, and then I'm going to insert some new layers. I'm going to click the insert button, and you can see then that we have obviously a new layer that's been added. And so just so it's clear, as I was saying before, I had one layer, which was this structure layer with the metal material set to 90. Have you ever wondered what these grey core boundary layers are for? Any idea what they do? Pretty much, yeah, that's right. Yeah, they're the structure. That's right, exactly. Yeah, so the core, in American terminology, is the structural part of your wall or your floor. Essentially, the structure, anyway. So that's really useful when you are joining things together. So when you join a floor to a wall, for example, you'll see that those things are going to connect, and the parts outside will connect differently.
Isn't it for wrapping plasterboard as well? So
that's right.
Above, you can make it wrap in the corner.
Exactly. That's right. Yeah, that's right. So the cores, will connect to each other, and the things outside it will connect. That's right, exactly. So here you can see this one's still inside the core boundary, but it is going to be a finish. So I'm going to click the up arrow there to move it outside. And so you see, that's like you're saying, you've got these options for structural, and it's a tick box, but you shouldn't really turn that off for things inside the core, usually. And then you have the wraps option if you want it to wrap around and connect to other things. And you can see that when you look at the preview. It's especially useful for the ends to have things wrapping, so you can have it wrap around the outside. I'll just leave that on none though, and I'll put in a thickness so you can see what that does. You can't see it yet because I don't have a thickness, but if I make it 10 mil, you can see there's my new layer. And if I change the wrapping option there to exterior, it's going to wrap around the outside, so that the ends have plasterboard when that's exposed. If I change it to interior, then it won't wrap anymore because this is an exterior layer. So how do you know which one's exterior and which one's interior with Revit?
It says exterior on the top.
Spot on, yeah, exactly, yeah, that's right. So here you've got exterior side and interior side. It's one of those built-in things that's always been there, but it's easy to miss. And it's a great option in Revit, or it's a great setup in Revit to have that built in. So, the top is always the exterior side, bottom's interior side. And it's that simple, put things towards the top when they're meant to be on the outside. And so, for construction purposes, that is critical with Revit, that you do differentiate between the exterior function and the interior. For interior walls, doesn't matter so much, but you still will have an exterior and interior side even for interior walls. So then you also have the function. And so when you set it to structure, obviously it's going to connect to other structural elements. Even if you don't have this option here ticked, that structural material option is more for to make it work with the engineering calculations and things like that. But the function there is generally to do with the way things connect. So you only have one structure. Then you have substrate as well, which is essentially for structures within the element. So framing, for example, that's there inside a wall to support finishes, for example. So in, say, a weatherboard wall, you might have battens that are supporting the outer finish layer. You can also have solid substrate materials as well. So it is kind of like an extra structure, but again, structure within the wall or floor or ceiling. And so I'm just recording. Okay, so then you have the thermal layer. That's thermal air layer. That's fairly self-explanatory, either for insulation or cavities, particularly for cavities. It can be for insulation as well. Membrane is generally zero thickness, and again, obviously for membranes. So the only one there that's maybe a little bit confusing is the finishes, because you have two finished layers or two finished functions. So has anyone worked out why you have two? Finish one and finish two? Exactly, that's what I get. Yeah. So yeah, finish one is for exterior and finish two is for interior finishes, because you don't want your interior finishes going through and trying to connect to the exterior finishes. They'll go through your structure if you do that. So it's really important that you set those separately. So yeah, like you're saying, finish one is for exterior, and so I'm going to go now to the make a plasterboard material. So I don't have a plasterboard material as it is. So I'm going to show you a couple of ways of making new materials. So how have you been shown to make a new material? Before you even get to the image, just to make a material in the list here. That's right, yeah. So that's one option. So you can go create a new material, which will make a blank material starting from scratch. It's not a bad option. You can also go to here. So that panel there is actually the main Revit material library. There's another one that you might know. You might be thinking of the appearance library, which is another one. But this is actually the main library. So if you don't see it, it's the button up the top, just to the right, next to the drop-down where you have the options to display materials. You've got the button that looks like a rectangle with a few divisions. So that hides and unhides the Autodesk materials there. You've got a couple of folders, so you've just got Autodesk and AEC. AEC is just architecture, engineering, construction. It's actually just another Autodesk thing. And so then you have Autodesk materials. They're pretty similar. There's slight differences, but they're quite similar. So they're pre-made complete materials. And so there you can see, I don't have plasterboard, but I've got plaster. And so that will save you a little bit of time. Instead of making it from scratch, you can just click on the arrow there. And what that will do is take it from here. Notice how these are all locked. When you hover over them, you'll see it's got a padlock there to show you this is hard-coded. You can't change that. It's built into the program. But when you click on the arrow there, that adds it to this list. So what do you think this list is compared to that one? What's the list up the top there? So? You can edit, yeah, definitely, yeah. And those are the materials in your project file. So you won't get this globally. If you go and open up another project, you won't have the same list. So they're stored in the Revit file you're working in, the RBT file. So there I've got plaster, and like you're saying now that I can edit it, if I right click and go to edit, and, sorry, not edit, rename, sorry, right click and rename, and I can give it a new name. And I can change any of these settings. So we've looked at the patterns there. For plasterboard, you probably don't need a pattern. So if there was a pattern there, just a random one, whatever it is, and you want to clear it, make sure you know there's the no pattern option down the bottom, which will just clear any pattern. You may want to cut pattern. For plasterboard, when it's zoomed in, it sometimes is good to have a pattern, so this gypsum plaster pattern isn't bad. But at the scale we're at, most likely I'm not going to see the pattern at 1 to... Oh no, so I've got it 1 to 20, so maybe I will see it. 1 to 100 you probably won't. So I'm just going to click OK. You can see we've got that, that layer added. And then I'm going to click Insert and click the down button, this time to move it all the way to the bottom, below the core boundary, particularly. And so the function there I'll make finish 2, and I'm actually going to go back and make the first one finish 2 as well. Because this wall would never be used for an exterior. A stud wall that's got plasterboard, obviously can't be waterproof, so we know it's only going to be an interior wall. So the function there can be finish 2 for both. And then the plasterboard material I can reuse just by clicking browse there and then OK. And then the thickness again, I'll make 10 mil. And then I'm going to change the thickness for the structure to 70, so that the overall wall thickness remains at 90. Clicking OK, and you can see now that I can see that in plan. But again, if I just go back to course, you'll see it doesn't show those layers. So just to remind you, if we look at the wall type options, that we've got the fill pattern there, which we can adjust, and it's overriding any materials and also any layers that I've added to the wall. If I turn the wrapping off, it'll change the preview there, but it won't actually change the way it shows here, even if I go back to fine, because I don't have any exposed ends. I'll just draw in a new wall with the same wall type. And then you'll see a bit more what wrapping does. So there you can see the wall's got an exposed end. So if I go back to select it and edit type, and so actually what I'll do is I'll move that over and I'll select this wall. It's the same type, so it doesn't matter which one I edit. Just take the preview away. And then I'm going to change the wrapping at ends option to here, either exterior or interior, doesn't matter, because it's an interior wall. Click apply, and you can see then it's wrapping at both ends. So it's wrapping that exterior finish around the structure, which is really useful. It will get in the way sometimes though, especially when you have to do manual joins. So sometimes you do need to turn that off. For inserts, if you have inserts set to wrap there, and often both is a good option, then it will wrap around things like reveals for windows and doors, which again can be useful. It's actually a problem sometimes with doors, but really useful with windows. So you'll often need to just customise that option depending on which one you're doing. So again, clicking edit there, look at that material again. Okay, so that's all the graphics tab. And so you can see there we've got plasterboard over here, and obviously these are the settings I have in graphics for that material. Then if I go to appearance, you can see that it has a new name there, fine white. Now, another method you can use to make a new material, instead of making it from scratch by creating a new material or getting it from the library, that's right, you can duplicate. So I'm going to duplicate this material by just right-clicking over here on the left and choosing duplicate. And I'm going to call it plasterboard painted red. And so over here in appearance, you can see that it's still got the same name, fine white. So if I change the colour here, to change the colour I've actually got to clear this. I'm going to come back to the image options. But, well, what do you think would happen if I change the colour there? Do you think it's going to change the colour of the material? No, exactly, that's right. So what do you do to get rid of the image? Yeah, that's a good move. Yeah, so you click on the arrow, that's right, yeah, and just click remove image. And for things like plasterboard, it's actually going to get in the way if you use an image. You don't need that texture at all for the image, for the surface, I mean. So now I can click on the colour and it will change it. But have I missed a step? So I've changed the colour there. That's obviously changing. But notice how over here, the original plasterboard material has also changed. And this is probably the number one area of confusion with materials in Revit. I see almost every single person I've seen learning Revit has an issue with this. And I got frustrated with it when I first came across it. It was with Revit 2009, I think it came in. And so the reason it happens is because the appearance material is actually a separate thing to the main material in Revit. So think of these as your Revit project materials. And then notice with appearance, it's got fine white and there's a 1 there. So that 1 tells me this fine white appearance material or render material is being used by another material. If it's only being used by this one, it'll have a 0. So, back to plasterboard, you can see it's still using fine white, and I will set that back to white. Just dragging the slider here. And then now plasterboard painted red. It's got its own graphic settings, just to prove it to you. I'll make that red. It wouldn't be the best way to do it, but just so you can see that when it's red won't affect the original plasterboard. It's still the grey that it started with. But the appearance is linked. So do you know what to do to unlink them if you want them to be separate? A couple of options. You can duplicate the appearance, just like you can duplicate a project material. When you right click on the tab there, choose duplicate, and that basically decouples them or makes them not link together. So now, if I change the colour here, it's still the same kind of material it was. It's a generic material. So it hasn't changed in any way, but it's not linked anymore. So here, the original appearance, fine white, is still white, but plasterboard painted red. It's got that name, fine white, but it's got the 1 there, so that's a new name. And it's got its own colour. If you want to change the name, it's in the information here. You can change it if you want to. So I can make this fire or red. And that will go up there. If that's something you're worried about. But the main thing is they're different. So that's an option. You can duplicate. The other option is to go to replace. And that will replace it with a brand new material from the appearance library. So like I was saying, there's another library apart from the library of project materials that I just showed you. So here, these are your main Autodesk materials, which are complete materials. So they have graphics, appearance, physical, thermal. They set all of those things. But when you right-click and go to replace, these are just appearance materials. So they're render materials. And so this is where it's a little bit confusing, because when you install other Autodesk programs like AutoCAD, 3ds Max, Navisworks, Showcase, they all use what's called a common Autodesk material library. This is what they mean, not the other thing, not the other library. So this appearance library, what's called the appearance library in Revit, is the standard Autodesk material library that you get in all those different programs. And it's a really good system, because it means if you assign a material from here in Revit, it's going to come up the same in 3ds Max or AutoCAD. So you have all these pre-made materials. Again, they're locked, so you can see the padlock there. So they're hard-coded. You can't change them here. You cannot change this library. But it's a really good starting point to use to make your render materials. So if we go to stucco, for example, we've got all these different plaster materials that are painted. There is a paint folder as well. And so I'll just double click on paint. Got a new material. Again, it's got this image there, which I can clear and then set a paint colour. Okay, so that's a simple paint material, and I'll make the colour red again, I suppose. But notice that it is generic. So, have you seen how sometimes you'll get different names there? So instead of saying generic, it'll say something else. Yeah, well, yeah. No, well, there are other options though. So here, I'm going to go to replace again and try and get one that is not generic. That's generic. You'd think that in the Autodesk library they would give you some wall paints, but here we go, pink maybe? Oh no, here we go, so these, you can see actually these are all generics. Where's the wall covering? No, miscellaneous. There's got to be one in here somewhere. Finish? No. There definitely will be some. Here we go, wall paint, there we are. So here we go. So you've got the wall paint folder, and you can see there you've got all these materials of type wall paint. So I'm just going to choose one. And I think this is much better than using one of those generic ones. So going back to the original plasterboard, notice how it's a generic material. So you've got all these different settings, which are useful sometimes, but the one that I've just made plasterboard painted red, I've now set that to wall paint. I can just choose a colour there. And then you have these preset options, like the glossiness option, really, or the finish option, whether it's flat, eggshell, and so on. Pearl, whatever, basic reflection type you want. And then the application, whether it's brushed, roller, or spray. There's no option for bumps because you don't need it, but you have a tint option there, which is good for things, I mean, basically car paint and things like that have that sort of finish. Usually for wall paint, though, you don't actually need that. Okay, so I'll just sort of show you briefly these different material types. I'm going to spend a bit more time on that afterwards. But notice how I can't set an image there. So if you wanted wallpaper, you'd need to use a different kind of material. So it's important that you realise this is using, it's actually what's called an Arkham design material. It's something came originally from 3ds Max. And you have these different material templates that give you different sets of settings or different groups of settings. And that's extremely useful. So generic is the base material that gives you all of the settings, but many of them, here's another one, plastic, will give you fewer settings, which simplifies things, but they also give you automatic settings. And for some things like water, that's extremely useful, but also even things like wall paint. So you get these automated settings which save you doing a lot of more complicated settings that you'd have to do with the generic material to get the same thing. So I'm just going to spend a bit of time afterwards on appearance materials and go in further depth into that. But that should be enough to get you started with designing materials. And often there is a bit of confusion with materials, and you think, or people sometimes think that it's all about setting images. You can actually do just as much with, going back here to a generic. Here we go. You can actually do just as much with some of the other mapping options, like checker, gradient, and so on, which are perfectly valid maps that you have in addition to using an image map. So, like I said, I'm going to spend a bit of time on appearance materials afterwards. But then just to finish up with the basic options you have with materials, if I click OK here, you can see there that we now have the shading colour set in the plan view, which is often not what you want. So I'm going to go back to hidden line, and you can see that it won't use that colour anymore. Same in section. Okay, so this is at 1 to 50, so it's difficult to see that that cut pattern because the line weight's too heavy. So I'll go to 1 to 20, and now I can see again that we've got that colour there. So often it is easier just to have the plan and section views set to hidden line. And my interior design students who actually still need to do quite a bit of rendering in their plans and section views will actually do most of the rendering with InDesign or Photoshop. And if you do need to have complex or interesting graphics for your for your orthogonal views, plans and sections. That's probably what I'd still recommend, even though Revit can do some reasonable things if you want high level, especially rendered plans, but also sections where you're showing materials for things like floors especially. It does work better, and you get a lot more control with a graphics program like InDesign. But Photoshop can be good too. And my preferred program is actually Illustrator, but we often don't have time to teach that, so again, I probably recommend InDesign is the one to start with. So again, they're the plan and the section views, and it's important that you realise how the materials are going to work in those views. And then just going back to that 3D view I had set up, you can see now that it's using the shading colour for the walls there. This wall, you can see, even though it's set to wrap at ends, it actually doesn't wrap around in the 3D view. It's just one of those things with Revit. It doesn't do it. So the shading colour there won't be used on the end of the wall. You can set it if you're using the object styles, the way I mentioned earlier. You can go in and set options for your object styles to get some of the ends to wrap or to have a colour automatically. And I'll come back and spend a bit more time on object styles later as well, so make sure you realise that that option that I showed you before by category, which you will see come up quite often in here, is referring to the categories that you have in object styles on the Manage tab. But notice many of them don't have a material set just yet. So if I go to walls, and then we can set a material over here as a default. I probably wouldn't want plasterboard painted red as my default material. I'll just set that as an example so you can see there. Sorry, you can go back into here. So you can set them all to that. No, still probably won't do it. No. So there are ways if you play around to get it to wrap, but usually there's an easier way that most people use instead. And well, do you know what it is? If you just want to change an individual surface that's not coming up with the material you want, that's the easy way. Exactly, paint. So that's where you should be using paint. I've seen actually more with interior decoration than any other course, because the decoration students, hopefully they're not listening to this, but sometimes they're not all that interested in the technical parts of these programs and learning all the different ways you should be doing things, and they just want to do it the quick way. So they'll use paint for everything. I've seen people paint every single surface in their projects. And some of the decoration students actually do really complicated models because they're modelling all of their furniture and fabric and these other things, and I'll see them then go and pick every single one of those surfaces using paint to assign a material, which is really time consuming. But in situations like this, it's a great option. So using paint, you need to have a material already made. So if you don't have the material there, before you use paint, sometimes you need to go to Manage, and then you can go directly to Materials if you don't know, and you can make your material there first. Then when you go to Paint on the Modify tab, it's going to be available in the list. Select it. You've got to leave this open while you're using Paint, of course, and then you can just choose that surface. Like I said, there are automated ways of getting it to come up. I've done it before, but yeah, probably not worth fiddling too much with that, because you can just use Paint. And so all of that is using the graphics panel, the settings in that graphics panel. If you go to Realistic, of course, then it's going to use whatever is set in the Appearance panel. So going back to here, we have the plasterboard painted red with a different appearance. It's still called Cool White. That doesn't really matter though. If we give it a different name, it's better, but again, it's not that important. And so it's probably even clearer on something like the columns over here. They have an appearance which is different to the option set in graphics, where it's using this pattern and colour. So you can see though in some cases you're going to get an object that's cut. In this example, that material is fairly simple, but if I go to a floor that's got a cut pattern, even in if I go to realistic, then it's going to show again the appearance when it's being cut. But when you go back to shaded or hidden line, you'll have those different options for cut pattern and a surface pattern. So, like I was saying, I'll spend a bit of time in the next video looking at render materials, which is what you have on the Appearance tab. And so, for that, mostly, we'll just go to the Manage tab and then go straight to Materials there. Okay, but like I said, if you want to go further with this, it's done in much more detail with 3D rendering programs, and so as well as the video I'll do next for you, if you have a look at my YouTube channel, you will see I've got videos there that show you how to do materials in 3ds Max, where it just uses render material. It doesn't have an equivalent to graphics materials or graphics options. And I've got a lot of other videos there on materials in Revit. So for example, this Harrington project, there we are. I've got a long video there that goes through all the options you have that I won't have time to spend today looking at render materials in a bit more detail as well. And sorry, there is one last thing I want to show you with graphics. So just going back to the material in maybe in Plan. Right, so we've got there a different kind of wall. Oh, sorry, two other things I want to show you. So, firstly, you can see there that the column, notice how it's got a heavy line going around the outside, but then a thin line on the inside. Any idea why it does that? As opposed to, we'll see over here, we've got another column where it's got a heavy line, and notice how there, see, wrapping's a problem sometimes, like I was saying, so the wrapping there is not helping. So you've got to watch out for that. Wrapping, everyone at first when they see it will think it's just good to turn it on for everything, but it will actually get in the way in some cases. So I don't want that to wrap. So I'm going to go back to wrapping and set wrapping at ends to none, and that will fix that. But that's not the main issue. The other issue is that we've got a heavy line there, and that shouldn't be heavy. So I know they tell you at first that everything that's being cut in your floor plans should have a heavy line on the outside, but it's not that's not entirely the right way to describe it. It's really the envelope, the outside edge of things that are being cut, the exposed edge, that should be heavy. So here, that should be a light line. So to get it to be a light line, do you know the trick to make that light? There is a way in Revit, just join it. So you've got on the Modify tab, you've got the Join tool. And the general rule of thumb, anything that's connected in Revit, you should try and join it. It makes the display much better. So if I use Join there, it makes that a light line. So that's a really nice option. But now, if I go, what people worry about then is if it's in coarse, it's going to give you the material that's set for the wall. The wall actually takes precedence over the column. So I'm going to unjoin those and show you the way it was. So if I unjoin those, so notice how the column now is the colour. Columns don't have a coarse option. So not everything in Revit has coarse. So you've got this graphics section for things like walls and floors. Well, actually, would you have an idea which objects give you that coarse option? It's a certain type of objects, getting into the sort of technical side of Revit, but it's good to know. So hopefully you've been thinking a little bit about those family types I mentioned at the beginning. You've got system families, and then you've got all the others, loadable families and modelled in place. They're the two basic kinds of objects you've got in Revit. System families, used for basically the critical discrete elements in a project. So that's walls, floors, ceilings, roofs, railings, stairs, ramps. They're all system families. So what that means is they're hard-coded into Revit and you cannot change those. They're built in as predefined families and you can't make your own. You can make your own types, but you can't make your own system families. Most of the system families have this option for a coarse fill pattern and a coarse fill colour. So walls, floors, roofs, ceilings all have that option. But columns, they're not a system family. They're a loadable family. They don't have that option. Okay, so you can't set that colour. But if you join a column to a wall, notice how it'll pick up the colour that's set in your course display in the wall. That's actually good because for presentation style drawings where you don't want to see all of the detail and you just want to simple fill quite often for these elements, that's extremely useful. But when you go to fine, it'll take that off. So you don't have to worry about the columns not being set to the material that you've got. So you can still go and set a material to your column and it'll display in fine. So then the very last thing I wanted to show you with the patterns, going back to the hatch patterns. So I mentioned at the beginning that, and we can see actually with the columns one last little interesting thing as well. Well, I think it's interesting. Notice how with the walls I've been going to edit type to get to the material. And for many objects it'll be the same, whether they're system families or families that you have loaded, like a furniture piece or something. Okay, this desk, same thing. To change the material, I go edit type, and there are the materials. But you might have noticed for some things, you don't go edit type. If I select the column and then edit type, there's no material there. So where should you be looking if you don't see it in edit type? You can. That is definitely an option. That's worst case if we don't have the material parameter in the project file, then you will need to go into the family and find it there and sometimes put your own parameter in. But another thing you should always look for is the material in properties. So this is an instance-based material. In other words, it's set individually to each column because that's the way engineers like it. That's right. Yeah. So there's a bit of a trick. If you want to set the material for all the columns in one go, you can just right-click and go select all instances in entire project. Yeah, visible wouldn't work here because I've only got one visible, but yeah, sometimes that's good. But in the entire project, we'll get every column of that type. So I've got 110 of them. So it's much easier than going and selecting them manually. But that's what you have to remember. If it's instance-based, in other words, coming up in the properties panel, you have to select every object of that type to change all of the materials for all of those objects. So in many cases, if you find that you're doing that a lot, it's easier to go and edit the family and change the material parameter to type-based instead of instance-based. Then it will come up when you go to edit type, and just changing the material for one column is going to change all of them. So then, if we look at that cut pattern, remember I was saying that some of the patterns can't be defined by simply putting in some parameters. In other words, putting in some numbers. And the concrete pattern's a good example of that. So I want to get a different pattern, and concrete is probably a bad example, so I'm going to put in a floor material. Well, I'll just do one over here as an example. So I'm going to put in a floor. It's a very simple one. And I'll just lift it up above the floor level. And I'm going to give it a new material. Just call it floor. So I'll add in a new layer, move it to the top. And by the way, with floors, it doesn't have a label for the exterior or interior because that wouldn't make sense for floors, but the top is the top, the bottom is the bottom. It's just stacked vertically, which is pretty obvious, but yeah, just worth putting that out. So here I'm going to put in a new finish layer, finish 1, that is just 20mm thick. So I'll show you the preview here. So that's on top, and then I'm going to change the material of that layer. So I'll get I'm just going to make a wood. So I'm just going to start with the wood material there, but I want a surface pattern on this that's different to what I've got in the library. So clicking there on the None option, I can go to, as always, for surface patterns, model. Don't have many to choose from there. I want a different flooring pattern. So to do that, I'm going to click New to make a new one, Custom, and then Import. So any idea? Well, you can see actually what files it uses. It tells you down the bottom here. It uses PAT files. So have any of you come across PAT files before? PAT? They're used in AutoCAD all the time. So AutoCAD uses the same format to make hatch patterns, and that means that you can actually get any hatch pattern file that's been made for AutoCAD and use it in Revit. You do need to go and edit the file usually and put in model or drafting at the beginning, but otherwise they work perfectly in Revit. So that's a great resource because you'll find there are millions of free AutoCAD hatch patterns you can find online, and you can just bring those into Revit, and they work perfectly. You can also get Illustrator patterns to work sometimes as well, but that's a bit more fiddly. So here going to the Revit library folder, if you go to the old Revit library 2012, and then to library, there's a folder called X hatch patterns, and you'll see there a pretty reasonable selection of these were AutoCAD hatch patterns that have been modified for to work in Revit, basically. So some of them only have one pattern, others have several. So I'm going to choose this one, Revit.pat. Oh, so let's look at max or so. So max.pat I'll choose. I'm going to click Open, and you can see then that we've got this list of materials. So I can just choose those, and then you can see what they look like. So that's how you get custom patterns in. I can change now if I go to Import again, and then I'll choose Revit, which will have a lot more in it. So just flicking through those, you can see all these patterns. There are dozens in this file, and so that's something like what I might want for floorboards. Now, the only thing that's maybe a bit tricky when you're doing this is getting the size. You can't go back and edit it. It's just one of those things with Revit. So you've got to set the scale, and so if I click OK, it's on 1. If I click OK again, and OK again, and again, and again, I can see that size. And if I decide I want that to be bigger, I can't go and edit it now. I need to go back to Edit Type, Edit, find it, click on the pattern, and you can see there if I click Edit, that the scale's grayed out. So I'd need to go and import it again. So I can go back to Revit again, and then find that again. Yeah. Oh no, it doesn't. Well, it won't change the file, but it will. Yeah, it'll change the material. Okay, so there's the same pattern I used, and I can then just change the scale there to say 2, and that'll make it twice the size. There we go. So very last thing I'll show you there is if you want to have a look at doing your own. This is something we used to do a lot years ago, but people maybe these days would normally just download others that people have made. But it's not as hard as you might think. If you just open that, you can see how they've been defined. So this is all just information for you. If you don't know any programming or any, this is just scripting actually. The semicolon there means it's a remark. So that's just notes. The program ignores all of those things, all of those lines that have a semicolon. So it's only the lines that don't have a semicolon that do anything. And so here, this is a pattern. If I go down to the one I just showed you, it was one of the wood patterns. So you've got all these numbers that basically define the pattern. The more complex ones are going to have a lot more numbers. And unfortunately, it's not just an X and a Y coordinate, it's actually an angle and then a distance. That's the way it works. But look it up if you just Google creating AutoCAD hatch patterns, and you'll see you get all the information on creating them, and then you can make your own. And I've made dozens of them over the years. But again, for standard things, you can probably just search for them online and then import them into Revit. So if you get one that you want to use that's been made for AutoCAD, all you need to do is change this line where it tells it if it's a drafting pattern or a model pattern. It's that easy. Just add that line in, copy and paste from one that you already have, and that will make it work in Revit. That easy. So, like I said, that's the basics of materials. Going back to materials here. Mainly at graphics, we've touched on the appearance tab as well, so I'll spend a bit of time when I do the next video on just the render materials, what you have in the appearance tab, which is another whole area. Yeah, sure.
We're talking about textures and 3D.
That's what I'm doing. That's what I mean. That's the render materials. That's the appearance. Yeah. So I'll spend just as long on just that. That's a whole separate area. That's as you can go as deep as what I just showed you with graphics. You can actually go much further. Yeah, with just the render side of it, which is that appearance tab. So I'll do that after.